Imagine being worshipped by millions, standing under the brightest Hollywood spotlight, while hiding the biggest truth of your life. These men weren't just acting on screen. They were acting every single day just to survive. Because for them, fame came with a terrifying price. Silence until the grave. Today, we reveal the untold stories of 11 black actors who hid they were gay until the day they died. So before we begin, hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, was their silence a sacrifice or a tragedy? Alvin Ailey, the man who choreographed his silence. In the sweltering heat of segregated Texas, a young boy sat in a wooden church pew, watching bodies move like prayer, the rhythm of gospel claps, the tremble of sorrow in a mother's voice, the quiet endurance of black faith in the Jim Crow South. That boy was Alvin Ailey. And before he ever stepped onto a stage, he learned that survival itself was a performance. By the time the world would know his name, Alvin Ailey would become a titan of American culture. He would found the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. He would create Revelations, a masterpiece that carried the spiritual backbone of Black America to audiences across the globe. Presidents would applaud him. Europe would revere him. Critics would call him revolutionary. But in mid-20th century America, being a black man was already a battle. Being a gay black man, that was a risk with no safety net. Hollywood demanded strength. The black community demanded dignity. The industry demanded masculinity carved in stone. There was no room for softness, no room for ambiguity, no room for truth. So Alvin split himself in two. On stage, he unleashed longing, rejection, ecstasy, despair. Bodies reaching for redemption beneath invisible chains. His choreography pulsed with yearning. Dancers collapsed and rose again like survivors of storms. Audiences wept without always knowing why. They were watching a secret. Behind closed doors, Ailey carried a loneliness few could see. He understood the rules of survival. A scandal could cripple his company. A whisper could erase funding. A headline could reduce his life's work to a single label. So he chose silence. Not from shame, but from calculation. Every curtain call was a triumph. Every standing ovation, a reminder of what he could never publicly confess. Friends would later describe his bouts with depression, the weight of protecting his art, the burden of guarding his heart. He poured everything into movement because movement was the only place he could tell the whole truth without saying a word. And when illness began to consume him in the 1980s, during the height of the AIDS crisis, the world wasn't ready for another truth. When Alvin Ailey died in 1989 at just 58 years old, his cause of death was publicly described in softer terms, shielding his privacy, shielding his mother, shielding the image. Even in death, the performance continued. Only later would history begin to speak plainly. Only later would the full spectrum of the man be acknowledged. Not just a genius choreographer, but the human being who carried desire, fear, brilliance, and isolation all at once. Alvin Ailey moved the world. He gave Black America a spiritual language of motion. He built an institution that still stands. He turned pain into beauty so breathtaking that it transcended race, borders, politics. But the greatest choreography of his life was the one no one saw, the careful steps he took to protect his legacy in a world that might not have protected him. And that is the paradox. He taught millions how to rise, yet he had to remain partially hidden to do it. Was his silence a sacrifice of the art, or was it the price a system demanded from a man who deserved to live fully in the light? Alvin Ailey didn't just create dance. He created space, even if he could never fully stand inside it himself. Bayard Rustin, the strategist in the shadows. Long before the cameras captured Dr. King standing before a sea of 250,000 people in Washington, there was another man in the background, mapping the buses, training the volunteers, calculating every risk. His name was Bayard Rustin, and history almost forgot him. Rustin had the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. Tall, composed, with a tenor voice refined enough to carry spirituals across Broadway stages in the 1930s. He once performed alongside Paul Robeson. He recorded albums. He loved theater. He loved music. He loved the power of performance. But unlike actors who performed under stage lights, Rustin performed in the shadows of politics, where one misstep could destroy an entire movement. By the 1950s and 60s, he had become one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the civil rights movement. Nonviolent resistance, he studied it deeply. Organizing mass demonstrations, he perfected it. The 1963 March on Washington, the defining image of the movement, bore his fingerprints at every level. And yet, he could never fully step to the microphone, because Bayard Rustin was a gay man in an America where homosexuality was criminalized, pathologized, weaponized. His enemies knew it, and they waited. In 1953, Rustin was arrested in Pasadena on what was called a morals charge. It became ammunition. Political rivals didn't need to debate his ideas. They could simply threaten exposure. Civil rights leaders, terrified of scandal, pushed him aside. Some allies urged him to stay invisible for the good of the cause. So he made a decision that would define his life. He would sacrifice his spotlight to protect a mission. He coached Dr. King. He drafted speeches. He negotiated logistics. He absorbed blows meant for others. When cameras rolled, he often stood just outside the frame, the architect of history who could not claim authorship. And here was the cruel irony. Rustin believed deeply in living authentically. He was, in private circles, more open than many men of his era dared to be. But he also understood timing. He understood fragility. The civil rights movement was under constant attack. A scandal involving a gay strategist could have fractured public support overnight. So he swallowed the credit. He swallowed the applause. He swallowed the right to stand as the visible hero. The psychological cost was immense. Imagine organizing one of the greatest demonstrations for human freedom in American history, while being told your own identity must remain a liability. Yet Rustin never allowed bitterness to eclipse his purpose. He continued advising presidents, continued shaping policy, continued advocating for justice across race and class lines. His dignity never wavered. His intellect never dimmed. His voice, literal and metaphorical, never lost its resonance. When he died in 1987 at the age of 75, tributes hailed him as a master organizer, a pacifist, a civil rights legend. But only decades later would the full truth be embraced publicly that one of the greatest architects of American freedom was also a gay black man who had to measure every word, every appearance, every friendship. He wasn't hiding out of fear alone. He was calculating survival for an entire movement. Bayard Rustin stood for justice on the world stage. Yet he knew that if his own truth became the headline, the cause he loved might pay the price. So he chose the shadows. Not because he lacked courage, but because he had too much of it. And that is the tension that still echoes today. Was his silence a tragic compromise? Or was it a strategic act of protection for something bigger than himself? Bayard Rustin helped change America. But America was not yet ready to fully see the man who changed it. Joano Hernandez, the pioneer who locked his heart away. In the golden age of Hollywood, black men were rarely allowed to be fully human on screen. They were written as caricatures, servants, shadows, stereotypes meant to comfort white audiences, not challenge them. But Joano Hernandez was different. He carried himself with a gravity that could not be reduced. An Afro, Puerto Rican actor with a voice like thunder wrapped in poetry, he didn't simply appear in films. He commanded them. He came from a world far outside the studio gates, performing in circuses, working in radio, climbing toward an industry that was never built to welcome him. Then in 1949, everything changed. Intruder in the Dust. Hernandez portrayed Lucas Beecham, a proud black landowner falsely accused, facing down a lynch mob without lowering his eyes. He refused to beg, refused to shrink, refused to perform submission. For audiences, it was electric. For Hollywood, it was dangerous. His performance earned a Golden Globe nomination and placed him among the first black actors to embody intellectual strength and dignity on screen. Not as an exception, but as truth. But behind that powerful image was another reality. Joano Hernandez lived in America where simply being black in Hollywood required constant calculation. Survival depended on appearing safe, non-threatening, controlled, and for him, there was an added layer of peril. Because Joano Hernandez was gay, in the mid-20th century, the rules were merciless. The Hays Code policed morality. Studios maintained blacklists. Tabloids hunted whispers like blood and water. A hint of non-conforming sexuality could erase a career overnight, especially for a black actor already navigating racism at every turn. So Hernandez built a fortress. He avoided Hollywood's social circuit. He kept his personal life sealed away from cameras and gossip. No public romances. No interviews that lingered too long on private questions. No cracks in the mask. His public persona became intense professionalism and mystery, because mystery was safer than truth. Imagine the loneliness of that existence. To be celebrated for portraying freedom on screen while being denied freedom in life. To open doors for future generations while keeping your own heart locked behind them. While other artists might have sought refuge in underground queer communities of New York or Paris, Hernandez remained solitary, dignified, almost untouchable. Not because he lacked desire for connection, but because connection was dangerous. His career became his sanctuary. His silence became his armor. And the tragedy is that Hollywood applauded his talent while refusing to grant him the right to exist authentically. The industry wanted his strength, his voice, his brilliance, but not his full humanity. When Juano Hernandez died in 1970 at the age of 74, the obituaries called him a pioneer, a trailblazer, a man who shattered stereotypes long before the civil rights movement reached its peak. And that was true, but the door to his private life remained closed. No headlines spoke of love. No mainstream acknowledgement of the truth he carried alone. The world honored the actor while never fully seeing the man. Juano Hernandez forced Hollywood to look at black dignity with respect. Yet he lived in an era where his own dignity demanded silence. His legacy is courage, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that holds a line year after year, role after role, life after life, while carrying a truth that must never be spoken. And that leaves us with a question. How many pioneers had to erase themselves just to exist in history? Jeffrey Holder, the giant who danced between worlds. Before you ever heard him speak, you felt him. 6'6", a voice like dark velvet poured over thunder, eyes alive with mischief and intelligence. Jeffrey Holder didn't enter a room. He arrived, born in Trinidad, raised in color and rhythm. Holder carried the Caribbean inside him like a living flame. By the time America discovered him, he was already a painter, choreographer, actor, costume designer, a Renaissance man in a world that preferred boxes. Hollywood knew him as Baron Samedi in Live and Let Die. Hypnotic, theatrical, unforgettable. Millions recognize him from the Untold commercials, where his baritone turned soda into myth. On Broadway, he directed and designed The Wiz, winning 2 Tony Awards and redefining how black fantasy could look, sound, and feel. He was spectacle. He was sophistication. He was impossible to ignore. But spectacle can be camouflage. Jeffrey Holder married the legendary dancer Carmen de Lavalade, a partnership that lasted nearly 6 decades. Together, they were elegance embodied, a creative force admired across continents. Their bond was real, deep, artistic, enduring. And yet, within the artistic circles of New York and Paris, there were whispers, understandings, an awareness that Holder's identity existed beyond traditional definitions, fluid, expansive, complicated. But America in the mid-20th century was not interested in fluidity, especially not in a black man. The expectations were rigid. Masculinity had to be unshakable. Desire had to be predictable. The industry tolerated flamboyance as long as it could be labeled exotic, artistic, eccentric. But cross the invisible line into open acknowledgement? That was another story. Holder understood the line perfectly, so he danced along it. He leaned into theatricality so boldly that it became protection. His grandeur made people focus on his artistry instead of his private truth. His Caribbean mystique became a shield. He could be larger than life, as long as he never publicly defined what that life meant. It was a masterclass in navigation, because being a black man in America was already walking a tightrope. Add non-conforming sexuality to that equation, and the wire becomes razor thin. Holder chose brilliance as a strategy. He elevated black aesthetics to fine art. He painted bodies in color and myth. He staged worlds where black imagination wasn't restrained by realism. He gave audiences beauty so intoxicating they stopped asking questions. And perhaps that was the point. His life became an act of control revelation, giving the world everything except the one thing it demanded labels for. Did he suffer in silence the way others did? Not in the same visible way. There was joy in him, freedom in his movement. But even joy can exist within boundaries. Even freedom can be negotiated. When he passed away in 2014 at 84, tributes poured in. They called him visionary, groundbreaking, irreplaceable, a cultural giant. All true, but what remained unspoken in many mainstream remembrances was a complexity of the space he occupied, a black queer artist navigating decades when even a whisper could shift a career. Jeffrey Holder didn't deny himself loudly. He simply refused to explain himself. And in that refusal, there is both power and poignancy. He carved out room in a world not built for him, but he carved it carefully. He lived vibrantly, but strategically. He dazzled the world with color and confidence, while keeping certain truths wrapped in velvet silence. Maybe that was his choreography, not just dance on a stage, but dance through a society that demanded certainty. Jeffrey Holder didn't just survive Hollywood, he seduced it, and in doing so, he proved that sometimes the boldest rebellion is refusing to be defined at all. Tommy Lane, the tough guy who could never break character. On screen, Tommy Lane looked indestructible. A cold stare, a body built for impact, the kind of presence that didn't flinch when bullets flew or engines roared. In the 1970s, as blaxploitation cinema exploded into American theaters, Lane carved out a space in a genre fueled by grit and survival. He played assassins, enforcers, men whose silence was lethal. In Live and Let Die, he stood beside James Bond as Adam, controlled, precise, deadly. In Shaft and other urban thrillers, he embodied a brand of black masculinity that Hollywood both feared and fetishized. Tough, stoic, hyper-masculine, and that image became his cage. Because in that era, a black male actor didn't just play strength, he represented it. The 1970s were politically charged. The civil rights movement had reshaped America's conscience, but stereotypes still lingered. Black men were either threats or symbols, rarely allowed softness, never allowed ambiguity, and certainly not allowed queerness. Tommy Lane understood the assignment. To survive in action cinema, he had to project heterosexual dominance without hesitation. Studios wanted archetypes. Audiences expected machismo. Any deviation from that persona would have collided violently with the very roles keeping him employed. So Lane perfected the art of erasure. No public relationships. No interviews inviting speculation. No social presence beyond his work. His private life became a blank screen, deliberate, calculated. Imagine living for decades in side roles that demanded hypermasculinity, while knowing your truth would be seen as a contradiction. He wasn't just performing toughness on camera. He was performing it at premieres, in meetings, in casual conversations. Over 50 years of careful composure. And the irony? The industry praised him for his endurance, for surviving high-speed chases and brutal fight scenes, while never recognizing the real endurance it took to guard his identity in a world allergic to difference. By the 1980s and 90s, conversations around sexuality were slowly evolving. But for men like Tommy Lane, the risk calculation had already been ingrained. Coming out late in life wouldn't just rewrite his narrative. It might redefine every role he had ever played in the public's imagination. So he stayed silent, not because he lacked courage, but because survival had always required control. When Tommy Lane passed away in 2021 at the age of 83, the industry honored him as a legendary stuntman and character actor. Tributes celebrated his physical power, his discipline, his contribution to a defining era of black cinema. Only afterward did the whispers grow louder. The fuller story began to surface. And that's the haunting part. For a man known for playing characters who never backed down, his greatest act of restraint happened off-screen. He lived through revolutions, civil rights, Stonewall, cultural shifts, new generations claiming space. Yet he carried the habits of caution forged in harsher decades. Tommy Lane represented strength to the world, but strength for him meant something different. It meant knowing when not to speak, knowing when to protect the image, knowing when survival demanded silence. His legacy sits at the intersection of power and concealment. He gave audiences heroes who fought openly, while he fought quietly. And perhaps that's the cost we're only now beginning to understand, that an entire generation of Black performers mastered the art of appearing fearless, because fear had no room in the roles they were allowed to play. Tommy Lane never broke character, not even once. Jimmy Daniels, the elegance that hid in plain sight. Before Hollywood defined Black stardom, before television packaged identity into marketable archetypes, there was Harlem. And in Harlem, under chandeliers of cigarette smoke and jazz, Jimmy Daniels reigned. It was the 1930s. The Harlem Renaissance pulsed like a heartbeat through New York City. Poets, painters, musicians, revolutionaries. They were building a new vision of Black sophistication. And Jimmy Daniels was at the center of it. Tall, impeccably dressed, a voice smooth as aged whiskey. When he sang, the room didn't just quiet, it surrendered. Daniels wasn't confined to stereotypes. He didn't shuffle. He didn't grin on command. He performed in elite clubs from New York to Paris to London. He mingled with royalty, socialites, and intellectuals. He became more than a performer. He became a curator of culture, eventually owning and hosting his own club, shaping the nightlife that defined an era. He represented polish, refinement, control, and yet, in those same glamorous rooms, another truth quietly existed. Jimmy Daniels was a gay man at a time when being Black was already criminalized by prejudice, and being openly gay could destroy everything. In the artistic circles of Harlem and Europe, his identity was something of an open secret. Within certain communities, he lived with a boldness that defied the times. He was romantically involved with architect Philip Johnson, a relationship that unfolded discreetly but meaningfully. But the mainstream world, that was different. America in the 1930s and 40s had no tolerance for openly gay Black men in the spotlight. The press would have devoured him. Investors would have pulled back. His club, his empire, could have collapsed under scandal. So Daniels mastered discretion. He built an image so elegant, so untouchable, that question slid off him. He allowed the world to see the tuxedo, the microphone, the cultivated charm, but never the intimate details behind closed doors. Imagine the duality. In private salons, he could be authentic. In public headlines, he had to be immaculate. His life became a balancing act between visibility and invisibility. Too much transparency, and everything he built could shatter. Too much concealment, and he risked erasing himself. So he chose strategy. He let his artistry speak louder than rumor. He let his sophistication silence speculation. He became indispensable to Black nightlife, a gatekeeper of glamour in a segregated America that often denied Black excellence altogether. And maybe that was his quiet rebellion, to exist with dignity, to love discreetly, to thrive in an industry that offered no safety net. Jimmy Daniels lived long enough to witness massive shifts, from the heights of the Jazz Age to the fire of the Civil Rights Movement. He watched culture evolve, watched younger generations demand openness. He could never afford in his prime, but he never publicly reframed his story. When he died in 1984 at 76, obituaries praised his contributions to cabaret and his role in shaping Black artistic spaces. They celebrated the icon, the host, the gentleman of the stage. They did not celebrate the fullness of the man. And that silence feels deliberate, not just his choice, but society's. Jimmy Daniels proved that elegance could be armor, that charm could be protection, that refinement could shield truth long enough to survive. But survival always carries a cost. Behind every flawless performance was a calculation. Behind every perfectly tied bow tie was a guarded heart. He helped define an era of Black sophistication, while carrying a secret the mainstream world refused to accept. And in that tension lies his legacy. A man who lived beautifully, loved carefully, and left the stage without ever fully stepping into the spotlight of his own truth. Moses Gunn, the voice that carried weight. When Moses Gunn spoke, the air shifted. His voice wasn't just deep, it was seismic. It carried authority, intellect, gravity. On stage, he felt Shakespearean. On screen, He felt immovable. You didn't question his presence. You absorbed it. Born in St. Louis, raised in America still rigid with segregation, Gunn came of age understanding that every black man in the spotlight was more than an individual. He was a symbol, and Moses Gunn carried that symbolism with deliberate discipline. In the 1960s, he co-founded the Negro Ensemble Company in New York, a revolutionary institution that became a sanctuary for serious black theater. At a time when opportunities were scarce and stereotypes rampant, Gunn helped build a stage where black actors could portray complexity, intellect, and power without compromise. He wasn't chasing fame. He was building infrastructure. And when Hollywood called, it recognized what theater already knew. Gunn had range. In Shaft, he played Bumpy Jonas with commanding menace. In The Iceman Cometh, he delivered layered vulnerability. In Roots, he embodied generational memory with haunting precision. He was discipline personified, but discipline for Gunn extended far beyond craft. Because behind that towering public image of patriarchal strength, there was another truth, one that could fracture everything he was helping to construct. Moses Gunn was a gay man in an era when black leadership, especially within the arts, was tied tightly to traditional masculinity. The civil rights movement had created icons, strong, stoic, father figure archetypes meant to counter racist narratives that painted black men as unstable or inferior. To be openly gay in that climate, some feared it would undermine the political symbolism of black male strength. Gunn understood that pressure intimately. As a co-founder of a major black artistic institution, he wasn't just representing himself. He was representing a movement. Donors, producers, young actors, they all looked to him as a pillar. And pillars don't crack in public. So he chose reserve. He kept interviews professional, conversations measured, personal life non-existent in headlines. Whispers might have circulated in certain circles, but there was no confirmation, no declaration, no public rewriting of a narrative. He became a master of compartmentalization. On stage, he unleashed emotional depth, heartbreak, rage, tenderness, channeling feelings that had no outlet elsewhere. His characters often carried brooding intensity, as if hinting at unspoken layers beneath the surface. Perhaps that was where the truth lived. Because the irony is undeniable. A man capable of portraying the full spectrum of humanity had to limit his own, and yet he never allowed bitterness to define him. Colleagues described him as meticulous, serious about craft, protective of the institutions he helped build. He believed deeply in the responsibility of representation. He understood how fragile progress could be, so he protected it, even if it meant protecting it from himself. When Moses Gunn died in 1993 at the age of 64 from complications of asthma, the tributes focus on his legacy in black theater and film, his contribution to expanding serious roles for black actors, his intellectual command, his unforgettable voice. Only later would conversations grow more open about the fuller picture of his identity. But during his lifetime, silence was strategy, not cowardice, not denial, strategy. He carried the weight of a generation that believed survival required containment. Moses Gunn gave audiences characters rich with complexity and emotional truth. Yet in his own life, complexity had to remain controlled. He stood as a pillar so others could build freely. And that may be the quiet heartbreak of his story. A man who helped create space for black voices, but lived in a time when his own could not fully speak. Luther Vandross, the voice of love who couldn't say his own. If you fell in love in the 80s or 90s, chances are Luther Vandross was there. His voice didn't just sing romance, it defined it. Smooth, velvet, impossibly controlled. When he sang, "A House Is Not a Home," it felt like confession. When he sang Here and Now, it felt like a promise. 8 Grammys, over 35 million records sold. A catalog that became the soundtrack to weddings, anniversaries, late-night radio dedications. Luther Vandross was the voice of intimacy. And yet, intimacy was the one thing he could never publicly claim. Born in New York City, raised in the black church, Vandross understood early the power of presentation. The church shaped his musical genius and shaped the boundaries around identity. In the world he navigated, masculinity was sacred. Desire had rules. Appearances mattered. By the time he became an R&B superstar, the stakes were astronomical. The genre relied heavily on fantasy, the image of the perfect suitor, the emotionally available but unquestionably heterosexual leading man. His fan base was largely female. The industry was conservative behind closed doors. Executives didn't want disruption. They wanted consistency, marketability. And in the 1980s and 90s, being an openly gay black male R&B icon, that wasn't just risky. It was almost unthinkable. So Luther became a master of the polite pivot. Interviewers would ask about marriage, about the right woman, about settling down. He would smile, deflect, redirect, charm his way around the question without ever lying, but never confirming. He understood that one headline could fracture the illusion the industry depended on. An illusion was currency. The irony is devastating. He sang about longing with such precision that listeners felt he must be speaking from lived experience. The ache in his voice was real. The vulnerability was undeniable, but was channeled through neutral language. Pronouns softened, narratives universal enough to avoid scrutiny. He gave the world love songs, but he could not publicly say who he loved. Friends later described the loneliness, the isolation of fame layered on top of secrecy, the pressure to maintain perfection. Vandross was notoriously meticulous, rehearsing endlessly, obsessing over sound, refining every note, perhaps because control was the one thing he had. As the AIDS crisis ravaged the community in the 80s and early 90s, silence became even more complicated. Rumors could destroy careers. Illness carried stigma. Visibility carried consequences. So he stayed guarded, not because he lacked courage, but because he had seen what visibility cost others. When he suffered a devastating stroke in 2003, the world watched in shock. And when he passed away in 2005 at just 54 years old, tributes poured in from every corner of music. They called him legendary, a master vocalist, a romantic architect of modern R&B. All true, but the fuller truth, his sexuality, his private struggles, the guarded heart behind the love songs, became more openly discussed only after he was gone. And that's the haunting part. A man who taught millions how to express devotion, never publicly expressed his own. A man whose voice trembled with authenticity, had to measure his real-life vulnerability. Luther Vandross lived in a paradox. He built a career on emotional transparency while practicing personal concealment. He became the soundtrack of love while protecting his own story from exposure. And perhaps that is why his music still cuts so deep, because when he sang about longing, he wasn't pretending. He was translating a truth he could not fully declare. Luther Vandross gave the world permission to feel, but the world he lived in never quite gave him permission to be fully seen. Raymond St. Jacques, the pioneer behind the unbreakable mask. When Raymond St. Jacques appeared on television, he didn't just act, he shifted history. In the 1960s, America's living rooms were still segregated in spirit, even when laws began to change. Primetime television was overwhelmingly white. Black actors were rarely given dignity, complexity, or permanence on screen. Then Raymond St. Jacques arrived. With his distinguished voice, rich, gravelly, commanding, and an aura of intellectual authority, he became Simon Blake on the long-running Western series Rawhide. It was groundbreaking. The first time a black actor held a regular starring role in a major television drama. For millions of viewers, his presence was revolutionary. He wasn't a servant. He wasn't comic relief. He wasn't disposable. He was central. His career stretched far beyond television. From Shakespearean theater to the gritty rise of blaxploitation cinema, St. Jacques headlined films like Cotton Comes to Harlem, projecting an image of unshakable masculinity and refined strength. In an era when black men were constantly denied full manhood by racist narratives, Raymond St. Jacques became a symbol, a public counterargument. And symbols come with expectations. Hollywood didn't just want him talented. It wanted him safe. The black community didn't just want him successful. It needed him to represent stability, power, and traditional strength in a hostile world. So the persona hardened, dignified, tough, imposing, untouchable. But behind that carefully constructed image was a truth that could unravel everything. Raymond St. Jacques was a gay man. And for a black actor in the 1960s and 70s, being openly gay was not simply personal. It was political. It risked not only career destruction, but backlash from an industry and society obsessed with policing masculinity. For St. Jacques, the mask wasn't optional. It was survival. He understood that coming out could derail the very platform he fought so hard to build. Worse, it could be framed as betrayal, as though his identity would somehow weaken the progress he represented. So he became an architect of discretion. He cultivated the image of the refined bachelor, private, reserved, almost unreachable. His social life remained sealed away from tabloids and interviews. The Hollywood machine could not consume what it could not access. Whispers existed. Of course, they always do. But St. Jacques never gave the public a doorway into his personal heart. Instead, he poured his complexity into his work. There was often a brooding depth in his performances, a sense of unspoken experience behind the eyes, as if the characters carried more than the script allowed. Perhaps they did, because his life was its own script, one written in restraint. Imagine the emotional toll, to break barriers for an entire race, while being unable to break one for yourself, to be celebrated as a pioneer, while hiding a fundamental part of your humanity, to live as an icon of masculinity, while knowing masculinity itself was being used as a cage. Raymond St. Jacques lived through decades of change, civil rights victories, cultural revolutions, shifting conversations about sexuality. Yet the habits of silence formed in earlier eras rarely loosened their grip. When he died in 1990 at age 60 from complications of lymphoma, obituaries honored him as a trailblazer, a fierce advocate for racial justice in the arts, a man who opened doors. And that was true, but only later would the fuller scope of his journey emerge, the private sacrifices beneath the public victories. Raymond St. Jacques mastered survival in an unforgiving world. He carried the weight of representation so others might walk lighter, and that is the tragedy woven into his legacy. A man who shattered ceilings in prime time, but could never fully step out from behind the mask that made it possible. He gave America a new image of black strength, but he had to keep his own truth locked away to protect the very progress he embodied. Howard Rollins, the leading man who was running out of hiding places. Howard Rollins had the face of a star and the gravity of a statesman. When he burst onto the screen in Ragtime in 1981 as Coalhouse Walker Jr., he didn't just act, he detonated. Controlled fury, intellectual elegance, pain wrapped in dignity. His performance earned him Oscar and Golden Globe nominations for his very first major film role. Hollywood had found its next leading man. Tall, striking, magnetic, Rollins carried himself like royalty. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His presence simmered. And when he transitioned to television as Virgil Tibbs in In the Heat of Night, he became a weekly fixture in American homes, a symbol of intelligence, authority, and black excellence. He was everything the industry wanted. Handsome, powerful, commanding. But behind that carefully maintained image was a truth growing heavier by the year. Howard Rollins was a gay man in an era that offered no safe blueprint for a black gay leading man. The 1980s were brutal. Hypermasculinity dominated Hollywood. The AIDS crisis ignited fear and stigma. Tabloids sharpened their knives. Careers could evaporate overnight with a single rumor. And Rollins was not just a working actor. He was a symbol. The pressure to maintain a heteronormative superstar persona was suffocating. Interviews avoided personal questions. Relationships were hidden. Appearances were calculated. Every smile carried tension beneath it. But Rollins wasn't just battling silence. He was battling himself. The strain of living two lives collided with personal demons. Substance abuse, legal troubles, arrests that made headlines. The industry that once praised him quickly became less forgiving. Public scrutiny intensified. And through it all, the unspoken truth remained radioactive. Imagine carrying that weight. A man who portrayed justice on screen, while feeling hunted off screen. A man who embodied dignity, while privately fearing exposure. The tragedy wasn't simply that he couldn't come out. It was that he had nowhere to rest. In a time when openness meant professional suicide, especially for a black leading man, Rollins retreated inward. His performances became even more layered, vulnerability flickering beneath strength. Audiences saw intensity. Few saw exhaustion. The 1980s and early 90s offered little mercy. The AIDS epidemic devastated communities, but public understanding lagged behind compassion. Silence was often mistaken for safety. When Howard Rollins died in 1996, at just 46 years old from complications related to AIDS, the news sent shockwaves through the industry. The handsome leading man, gone, so young. Suddenly, the whispers crystallized into acknowledgement, and there it was, the unspoken truth that had shadowed his career. But by then, he was no longer here to tell it himself. Rollins' life feels like a collision between brilliance and a system unprepared to protect him, between talent and isolation, between visibility and invisibility. He gave audiences heroes who fought injustice, yet he fought alone. He carried the mantle of Black intellectual masculinity during a time when deviation from that image could be weaponized against him. And perhaps that's what makes his story ache differently. He wasn't just hiding from the public. He was hiding from a culture that demanded perfection while offering no grace. Howard Rollins was built to lead, to headline, to command the screen for decades. But the emotional cost of constant concealment, layered with addiction, stigma, and scrutiny, eroded the foundation beneath him. His legacy is brilliant, undeniable, but it is also a warning. What happens when a society applauds your strength, but gives you no room to be human? Howard Rollins ran out of hiding places, and in losing him, we are forced to confront the unbearable question: how many stars burned out because authenticity was treated like a threat? Paul Winfield, the legend who loved quietly until the end. Paul Winfield didn't act with force. He acted with soul. There was a rare stillness in him, the kind of quiet power that doesn't demand attention, but earns it. When he played a sharecropper father in Sounder in 1972, audiences didn't just see a character. They saw a redefinition. Black fatherhood on screen, portrayed with tenderness, dignity, vulnerability. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination and changed the emotional vocabulary of Hollywood. Winfield wasn't just talented, he was profound. His career stretched across decades and genres: Shakespearean theater, science fiction epics like Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, television triumphs like Picket Fences, which earned him an Emmy. He brought poetic sensitivity to everything he touched. He was one of the most intellectually formidable actors of his generation. And yet behind the accolades, behind the public brilliance, Paul Winfield lived behind an invisible curtain. For decades, he shared his life with his partner, set designer Charles Gillen Jr. It was not a fleeting romance, but a deep devotion, a domestic life built quietly, carefully, away from cameras and red carpets. A love story lived in whispers, because Paul Winfield understood the rules of his era. Hollywood demanded that its Black leading men embody traditional masculinity: strong, heterosexual, unshakable. Studios feared scandal. Audiences clung to familiar narratives. The industry was unforgiving toward difference, especially when layered on top of race. To be openly gay could mean professional annihilation. So Winfield practiced a masterclass in poise. He didn't feed gossip. He didn't invite speculation. He didn't grant the public access to his sanctuary. He was out only to a close circle of friends and colleagues, those who could be trusted. Everyone else received a version of Paul Winfield that Hollywood could safely consume. The respected actor, the dignified icon, the private man whose personal life remained politely undefined. It was silence a strategy, not denial strategy. And what makes Winfield's story especially haunting is how much humanity he brought to the screen while being denied full humanity in public life. His characters often carried quiet sorrow beneath strength, as if he understood intimately what it meant to hold something sacred inside. Even as he faced personal loss, including the death of his partner in the late 1990s, Winfield remained the embodiment of professionalism and grace. No public unraveling, no tabloid spectacle, just endurance. When he died in 2004 at age 64 from a heart attack, the world mourned an acting legend. Tributes praised his dignity as much as his talent. Only after his death did wider acknowledgement emerge about the life he had shared privately for so long. And once again, the pattern repeated. The truth spoken too late for the man himself to hear the world accept it. Paul Winfield's legacy is one of extraordinary balance. Conquering the heights of his profession while guarding the truth of his heart, he proved you could be an icon without surrendering your private soul. But he also proved something else, that an entire generation of Black queer artists survived by becoming experts in invisibility. Paul Winfield gave the world performances filled with honesty, yet he lived in a world that required silence. And when we look back at his life, we are left with the aching contradiction. How many legends did we celebrate without ever fully seeing them? These stories remind us that Hollywood's brightest lights often cast the longest shadows. For these 11 icons, fame came with an impossible bargain, artistic immortality in exchange for personal erasure. They weren't only fighting for roles, they were fighting for survival. Their silence was not weakness. It was a cost of living in a system that demanded masks. And now, the question belongs to us. Do we honor that silence as sacrifice or mourn it as tragedy? Because legacy built on brilliance is undeniable. But legacy built under oppression should never have been the price. Their stories deserve more than whispers. They deserve truth.